The past 2 months ago, or a month ago, oh my goodness, March and April, I was away on a sabbatical. And as Pastor Chris was away this Sunday, he asked if I would speak and kind of go through and report back and share with you some of what I experienced and did on my sabbatical. And there's a lot, of course, I could share there. So I've tried to condense it into what we can handle in one morning. So there's lots I won't be able to talk about. So feel free to come talk to me about that after the service or anytime during the week or whatever. There'll be a chance for you to dig into that a bit more. But I would like to start by just thanking you as a church, as our church, for giving us that gift of getting to take 2 months away to do some rest, some reflection, some reading, to be refreshed. I've been the youth pastor, associate pastor here for 9 years. And as of May, I'm 1 month into my 10th year here at Brightview. And it's been awesome. I've grown a lot here, and under your care and guidance and sometimes correction, sometimes very firm correction, I've been able to grow and really start to become the type of pastor that I'd always wanted to be, one who really cares for people and has the skills to be helpful. And so sabbatical is a pretty unique privilege, something that not everyone in life gets to experience, and pastors are one of those unique roles where we frequently take them every 7 to 10 years, usually, for a pastor to help us avoid things like burnout. So I'm incredibly grateful that you gifted me to that opportunity, that we were able to go. The main thing we did, the main project while we were away, was visiting youth pastors all over Western Canada and talking to them about youth ministry and just learning from them what they're doing in youth ministry and what kind of things were working, what kind of challenges they were facing. And then I recorded interviews with a number of those youth pastors, and we've been posting them online. I've been doing one a week, getting them online. And we called that web series Discovering Youth Ministry. And so that's why I started with that little video. That little video was the video my wife made as the intro to each episode. So that's like our what do you call that at the start of an episode of a TV show? It's like the opening, the intro, the opening music. So it's the best part of each of the videos is that first 30-second clip. And then it's just boring talking between me and a really interesting youth pastor who tells me about his youth ministry or whatever. So I actually posted one yesterday, and I'm taking a lot of today's sermon. Actually, a lot of it comes from the conversation in yesterday's video, which was between me and a college professor. And we'll get to that later on in the message here. So this morning, my goal is to report back a little bit, to share some of the experiences. And so we started off the journey, and I'm just going to kind of take you along on the journey with us. Over the course of the 2 months, we traveled 6,000 kilometers. That is not counting the trip to California and back. So I didn't do the math to figure out how far I went into from here to California and then around there and then back. I didn't do all of that. So just in Canada, we did 6,000 kilometers in 2 months. And I also flew to California and back at one point for a conference. I visited 14 youth workers or pastors in 10 different cities. And the little red car did all of it. Pretty amazing. It survived right up until like 2 weeks ago. And then it just decided, okay, we got you home. We're done. Yeah, so that was fun. We started off our sabbatical. Kathleen and I took our first week of the sabbatical. We went to a marriage retreat. Focus on the Family Canada does a marriage retreat just outside of Calgary. That's a specifically clergy care marriage retreat. So it's specifically for pastors, and they do a very small group of people gather for 1 week. So it was us and three. There's 4 total couples. Thank you. 4 total couples, 3 other couples, all of them in ministry as well. And we just get together, and their whole thing is they meet all your physical needs. So that all your food is just like, there's just food everywhere all the time. Like everywhere you look, there's food on a table somewhere. It's like, so we ate. and they kind of meet all your physical needs for the week so that you can rest and work on your spiritual needs and just be refilled and refueled. And for Kathleen and I, it was an excellent opportunity for us to just slow down the pace of our life and just take some time to focus on one another. So my mom visited and took the kids for us for the week, and Kathleen and I could just go away. And so we did, and we enjoyed that time. We played some board games together, and we sat around a campfire with the other couples and just visited and fellowshipped in a really meaningful way with all the pressure off. It was an excellent way to begin our sabbatical journey, to begin this trip of trying to rest and refresh. And so we spent time there. And in many ways, God showed up for us there. And that's the theme of this sermon. The theme of this whole trip ends up being the God who shows up. And in here we found the God who shows up to provide rest. And so we just rested. And it really set a tone for the rest of the sabbatical of slowing down, of taking time to focus on one another and on God. After that marriage retreat, we headed home, and I dropped off Kathleen, and then I headed out again right away. And for the next couple of weeks, I did a lot of journeying on my own. And the first place I went was into California. So I jumped on a plane, and I flew down to California, where I met up with a team of youth pastors in our denomination. And there was a group of us that went. There were 6 of us. And we went together to a conference at Saddleback Church. And it was a youth workers conference, and it's supposed to all be about youth ministry and all this kind of stuff. And it was a hard conference, to be honest. It was very, I don't know how to describe it entirely, American. It was very American. It was militant, maybe is a better word. I shouldn't just assume all Americans are militant. It felt very militant. It was like everything was a battle against the culture in the world, and not. That's not entirely wrong, but it was just the tone of it was all a battle. And everyone had to get ready for the fight to win. And that was hard, and the tone of it was hard, and I took a ton of notes. There was some really, really good stuff at this conference, and I'm still sifting through those notes, so I'm not digging into them much this morning. But 2 really cool things happened while I was in California on this trip with these youth pastors. The first one was after the conference had completed. So the conference wasn't even, that's why we were there. Honestly, I'm digging through those notes and there's some really good stuff in there, but it wasn't my major takeaway. But the night after the conference was done, I still had one more day in California, and the group of other youth pastors were going to Disneyland. And I didn't really care too much to go to Disneyland. My kids and wife aren't there. I'm not really a rides person. In other words, I don't go on rides. I don't really do fun. So I told the youth pastors that. I said, I don't really do fun. I also didn't want to spend $400 for one day at a thing I wasn't really that into. And so I was like, yeah, that's okay. I'm just going to sit here. I've got some video editing I want to do. I've got some reading I want to do. I'm just going to hang out in the hotel room. You guys go have a good time at Disney. And a big factor in my mind was I didn't want to pay the $400 or whatever. Because, yeah, what do you want to do that for? Anyways, that night was the night where I received an e-transfer of the love offering that you guys took. I had no idea. And so I actually thought it was an error. And I texted Glenn and said, I think you e-transferred the wrong person. There's no way that the church would be sending me this money. This doesn't seem like the right amount of money to be sending me. It should be a couple $100 for my reimbursement for the expenses I had before I left, church expenses, youth group supplies and stuff. It shouldn't be this number. And he's like, nope, that's correct. That's the right amount. That's a gift from your youth group and your church. And I just about started crying right there in front of all the other youth pastors that I was trying to be cool in front of. And then I took a few moments to just brag to them about how awesome my church is. And so I just bragged about you guys a whole bunch for an hour. They're like, our churches are cool too, Andrew. I'm like, no. Not like this. I have an awesome church. And so they said, well, now you have no excuse. You got to come with us to Disney. So I thought about it and I was like, wow, it's not really my jam, but really I could afford it now. I was not expecting to have additional funds. So I did, and I went to Disney, and it ended up being the right choice. Not because I got to hang out with Chewbacca in the new Star Wars exhibit area. I don't even know what you call those things. Like, I don't do Disneyland stuff, but it ended up being the right thing to do because I spent time with these other youth pastors in a less intense conference-y setting. So the second cool thing that happened, so the first cool thing was I was completely blindsided by your kindness and care for us. The second really cool thing that happened was that time I spent with the youth pastors. As I walked with them towards Disney or into Disney, some of them were still hurting and reeling from some of the things that happened at the conference. Some of the, in this team of youth pastors that I was with, many of them were women. And at this conference, they were basically told that they didn't deserve their positions. It was very inappropriate and wrong, the way that they were talked about. And so these women youth pastors were walking with me, and one of them looked at me and said, Andrew, I know that we probably don't agree on all of our theology, but I really am glad that I know that our shared love for young people unites us. And walls that were up between us that neither of us had intended to put there started to break down. And between myself and these other 6 youth pastors, a lot of walls came down that day that I spent walking around the park with them and sitting on benches while they went on rides. And I ate a lot of Disney food, like a lot of the food. But the times as we walked together and talked together, it just broke down these walls. And what was amazing was that it really set up the next stage of the journey for me when I was intending to come and visit them at their churches. And all of them had kind of been a little bit resistant. And suddenly there was an opportunity. And so even in Disneyland, God showed up, the heart of consumerism, and yet God came into it. I was going to start with reading a passage from the Bible, and I actually didn't do that. I just noticed I skipped that in my entire notes. John 1, in the beginning was the Word. The Word became flesh. Okay, so God shows up. That's the whole point of the verse I was going to read. After I got back from California, I took a bit of time driving, a lot of driving, on my own. So Kathleen and the girls were still at home. The girls were in school still. Spring break was getting close. And I got asked by a friend of another pastor who leads the gap year program for the CBWC called Kurios. It's a program that our denomination runs. They run it out of Jasper right now. It is a gap year, so it's 8 months long. They do a 1-month mission trip in, I'm going to get it wrong. I think they're in Guatemala, but I'm actually not 100% sure. I think that's where they go. And they do introductory Bible education, biblical education, like first year Bible school kind of stuff in the first year. And the leader of that, Steve, he gave me a call and he asked if I would come and teach on the book of Revelation at the end of their semester, which was in March. And I said, sure. I'm on sabbatical at that time, but why not? I'd love to come see what you guys do. So I went up and I spent 3 days in Jasper and teaching and did a 3-day intensive on the book of Revelation, which was, it was intense. It was good. And then right after that, I drove out to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan to visit a youth pastor friend there, Chris, and get to know him and a little better and hang out at his youth group and did a video interview and all that kind of stuff. So I drove in about 6 days, I drove to Prince Albert and back and to Jasper and back over the course of 5 days. So it was quite a bit of driving. And while I did that, I listened to audiobooks. That's what I like to do. So this is where we get into some of the stuff that really started to impact me. I've just taken you on the journey so far, but here's where things started to happen. During the many long drives that I took, I went through a series on Audible by an author named Andrew Root. Andrew Root, some people jokingly call him the patron saint of youth pastors. He is a youth pastor himself, and he has written at a very high academic level theological books, almost always keeping youth ministry and youth pastors in mind as he writes them. And so they're very interesting, and they're very much sort of a lot of youth pastors read his work. But he did a multi-book series. I think it's 8 books long. I own 6 of them. And over the course of my sabbatical, I read 3 of them. So I've still got 3 more to go of the 6 that I own. And it's a book series exploring Christianity in the secular age. And so he picks up on Charles Taylor's book, The Secular Age, and he starts to examine if today, right now, we live in a secular age, in a world or a time period where secularism is kind of not just on the rise, but it's actually the dominant cultural way of thinking. So in North America, that's probably the case at this point. Then where does Christianity, the church, pastors, congregations, transformation, where does all of that fit in a secular age? How does that belong, and what difference does that make? And so this is pretty intense philosophical and theological reading, but I really enjoyed it. And as I was driving, I just started crushing hours and hours of these books. Now, a big part of the secular age is something called the immanent frame. So I'm going to give you a little bit of education here. So the immanent frame. In this context, immanent refers to what is immediately present, tangible, provable, or seeable. Basically, if you can't interact with it with your five senses, then it's not real. So the immanent frame, immanent means it's immediately in front of us, it's tangible and real. The immanent frame is a way of looking at reality in which only that you can experience or prove through your five senses is real. Charles Taylor suggested in the secular age, an immanent frame is the only framework with which we view the world around us. This makes no room and leaves no room for anything transcendent, for anything beyond. It makes no room for God. So in a secular age, there is no place for God. God is a transcendent being above all creation and all created things. And so in a secular age, God has no place. Where then do we find things like transformation? Where then do we find things like mysticism? There is no place for those things in a secular age. So Andrew Root begins to unfold. Does the church have a place? Does God have a place? Where and how do we hold in tension the secular age that's rising and is around us already, and what we believe to be true about who God is? So there's a lot of good content, and like I said, this is an 8-book series that he wrote on this topic. So I can't condense all of his 8 books into one sermon. But the part that really impacted me was the part where he was in a book called The Pastor in the Secular Age. In one chapter, he gets into how God is a minister. God is a pastor. God is a shepherd. He kind of uses those 3 terms together all the time. Pastor, minister, shepherd, as sort of one thing. And he says God is a pastor, a minister, a shepherd. God steps into the immanent frame. He enters into time and into space, and he enters into real people's stories for relationship in order to minister to them. He steps into the life of Adam and Eve. When they're in the garden and they've eaten the fruit and they hide themselves away, he enters into time and space and ministers to them. He arrives for Abraham. He shows up for Jacob and Moses and Joshua and David and so many more, and I could make the list go on. And he shows up for John the Baptist. He shows up for Peter and John and James and Paul in the incarnation of Jesus. Throughout the biblical text, we see a God who is fully transcendent, and yet he enters into the immanent. And so we have a God who is both transcendent and immanent. If you remember Momentum from last year, we talk about that in our Momentum series about transcendence and immanence of God. God enters into the world in real time to minister to real people. This chapter struck me on a profound level. Not so much because the idea of God entering our world is new to me, or a new concept, or even something I haven't taught before, but because I think I'd fallen into the trap of viewing God as a theological concept to study. I had started to view God less relationally and more conceptually. And I think we get caught up in that really easily. It's part of being in the immanent frame. God becomes something we research, to prove, to make arguments for, rather than a God who we have relationship with, a God who ministers to us, a God who enters into our story. I had viewed him as a transcendental phenomenon. That's my big wording of the day. A transcendental phenomenon existing outside of the immanent frame that our culture expects us all to operate inside of. This chapter really impacted me, and I stopped the audio recording at that point, threw on a bit of worship music, and just let myself process this as I drove for the next little while. But the full impact of this chapter didn't really hit me at that moment. It didn't hit me for a few more weeks during another conversation. So I got home from these long drives to Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and Jasper, and I had a day at home to do some laundry, repacked, packed up the kids, packed up Kathleen, threw them all in suitcases. I just think the wording of we packed them up is weird. And we all hit the road together, piled into that little red car, and we headed down to Calgary, where I visited Tosh, and then across the mountains, and we went to Vernon. We almost didn't make it. And this was one of those places, this isn't really, I can't spend as much time in this part of the story. There's a whole theme of this story where unexpected things happen, right? And somehow God keeps providing our need. So as we're climbing the Rogers Pass, the check engine light that's always on in the car, because that's just how you do, the check engine light began to flash. And then the car began to shake kind of wrong and violently. So I took my foot off the gas climbing the Rogers Pass and just sort of slowed right down to about 70 kilometers an hour, 60 kilometers an hour. And the shaking stopped, the flashing stopped, and we just limped our way over the mountain, and then we were fine. So that was cool. So I called Ian and I'm like, hey, mechanic friend, any idea what this is? He's like, yeah, it sounds like your engine's misfiring cylinders, so it could blow up. I was like, cool. But it didn't. Anyways, not right away. So we started worrying about that a bit and we were looking at car ads. We're like, we might have to take a different vehicle home. But anyways, it didn't break. We went into Vernon and we spent a week in the Vernon, Kelowna, Okanagan area. And from there, we visited a number of people. We visited Jenny in Vernon. She's a youth pastor at a CBWC church. We visited Carly Turner. She's also a youth pastor at a CBWC church in Kelowna. And we visited Sid Coop, who is a well-known youth worker at Green Bay Bible Camp, is where he's mostly associated. We spent a week there and with friends, and it was good. And we went to the pool a bunch, we did some disc golfing, and we visited with youth pastors and friends. Nothing too major happened there. From there, we drove down to the Lower Mainland. We stayed with some friends of ours in Abbotsford, and we used Abbotsford as our base of operations. And from there, I was able to travel out to Richmond to visit a pastor friend there and to Mission. And at Abbotsford, the friends we were staying with live right across the street from Columbia Bible College, which is where Kathleen and I first met. It's where I got my first 2 years of biblical education, and probably where I got some of the most impactful biblical education I ever had. It was the first time that the Bible really opened up to me and I learned hermeneutics. I visited a pastor there at a multicultural church and went to his church service, and I would love to just spend a whole day talking about that and like trying a service there, getting you all to go to one of his church services. It was cool. It's a multicultural immigrant church. They had, during the service that I was there, 6 different languages were integrated throughout the service just naturally. I met a second Philemon, that was cool. He led the congregational prayer in French and English. I heard, it was just an awesome thing. It's a 2-hour long service with a 10-minute coffee break after the first hour. But the second hour is when the sermon is, so you don't like leave after the coffee, right? You come back in because you haven't heard the sermon yet. And so they did that really well. I think we could learn from that, because right now we do coffee and then small groups, and most of you leave. But man, small groups are good. You could grab a coffee and stay for small groups, full 2-hour church service. But they do that. They did like celebration at offering time. They put on like this really celebratory Swahili song. And like everyone danced down the aisles to put money in an offering box at the front of the church. And like people just like danced and jumped and like celebrated and high-fived up and down the aisles. And it was like the wildest time I'd ever seen. And then it just had on the screen, it just said, "We give with a joyful heart." And I was like, yeah, you do. Wow. Church blew my mind. I loved it. It was really fun. Really enjoyed that church, and I will definitely visit that church again when I'm in the Lower Mainland. And they were super welcoming to me too. It was great. Anyways, I also had the opportunity while I was in Abbotsford to visit with some professors at the Bible College. It was the end of their semester. They were finishing up finals and they had some time, which was great because sometimes professors don't have time for some random guy who shows up and goes, "Hey, I'm not one of your students. I'm not paying tuition, but I'd love to eat some of your time up and talk with you." They were like, "Sure." So I met with Michael Zook and Brian Cooper, who were professors I had back when I was a student. But I also met with Chris Clements. Chris Clements is the director of youth ministry at Columbia Bible College. He's the one whose the interview video I did with him is posted online yesterday. Chris and I had never met before this, but I knew he was the director of youth ministry, so I told him what I was doing, and I asked if he'd be willing to meet, and he said sure. So we met twice, once just to talk and meet each other, and the second time to make the video, and both meetings were excellent. This conversation with him began by him talking about how God is one who enters our world. That God doesn't just exist outside of our world and in heaven, but that he enters into time and space and connects with us. He is a God who is and a God who shows up. And I knew immediately that there was a connection in what we were thinking, reading, and exploring. And so I was a little bit, at first, rocked, a little bit shaken. I was like, wow, how did you know that this is the stuff I've been reading about? That kind of has been shaking me up the last couple of weeks. And so I'm like, okay, this is good. So I asked him, okay, so why does that matter? What do you do with that? I've been reading about that, I said, but what do you do with that? And so we took it to the next place. He and I had this incredible conversation about risky discipleship. It's a terminology he used. In fleshing this out, he suggested if God is one who shows up and God is one who speaks, then a definition for discipleship is one who responds to the voice of God. Chris had a lot of criticism for consumerism and the consumeristic kind of Christianity that we get caught up in our culture even when we don't mean to. In fact, interestingly, as we were talking about this in the video, I try to repeat back to him what I'm hearing him say. And after I repeat back to him, he kind of goes, "Wow, you're a good salesman." And I'm like, "Thanks. I did sales before I was a pastor." And he's like, "Yeah, you can tell." He goes, but you missed it because you were selling me a product instead of talking about the relationship with Jesus. So he calls me out right in the video. And I'm like, oh, I missed it. Okay. So then we have to go for another 20 minutes of him trying to educate me. And it's really good. But I think I understand. Because he criticizes this consumerism. The way he goes about this criticism is he says we often and easily make Jesus a tool to getting a fulfilling life. We often make Jesus a tool for getting what we want. He talks about how the world tells us that to be fulfilled, to be successful, to have a good life, we need to make the world more attainable, more available, more accessible. We need to increase our share of the world, right? And that's what the world tells us. So when you're going off to college, you're told to look for an education that will open up doors for you, that will make the world more attainable, more available, that you'll have a greater share of the world to access. You want more money. Why? Because that gives you more share of the world. You have more access, you have more availability, you have more attainability. The world tells us that you need to get these things, that every choice you make needs to be opening up more opportunity for you in the world. And so it's so easy for us then to make Jesus a way in which we open doors for ourselves. That Jesus becomes a tool to make the world more available to us. That Jesus is great because he's going to make you feel more complete or more full. So that's why you should follow Jesus. He's going to make you feel better about yourself. Or following Jesus will give you all the things you need added onto you, right? We use this terminology. It's pseudo-biblical, right? Because there is these things seek first the kingdom of God and all these things will be added onto you. And then so we focus on the adding on. Oh yeah, you follow Jesus and all these other things will get added on. So that's the point. And Jesus becomes a tool to getting everything else given to you. Follow Jesus and your joy will be deeper. You'll feel more happy, maybe not happy, but more joyful. It'll be deeper and better. You'll have a better life. You'll have a life and a life to the full. We use that verse a lot. But we use Jesus as a tool to get the full life. We've made Jesus into a product. And we sell him. And I'm guilty of this. Like Chris said, I'm a decent salesman. And I sell Jesus as a product to give people a better life. Well, this was starting to shake me up again. We've made Jesus into a tool. And then he said, no, we need to shift this. A risky discipleship is a discipleship that risks reducing our share of the world. It risks reducing our availability and our options and our attainability in the world. It reduces what we have. There's a risk of that. High risk. In fact, it probably will happen. His example was you take risks when you go into ministry, like you may never own a home. And he lives in the Lower Mainland. So I looked at him and he's like, yeah, no, that's a reality. I was like, welcome to the Lower Mainland. Can't afford anything there. Anyways, he says you take greater risk. But why do you do it? Not because you're seeking to get something, but because you are responding and being obedient and listening to the voice of the one who you're in relationship with, to the shepherd, the pastor, the minister who enters into the imminent frame, into the now, into relationship, into story, and calls us to be with him. Discipleship is not about following Jesus so we can get something. It's about following Jesus because he calls us to. It's about hearing the voice of God and following because he calls to us. And this will be risky because he does not call us in the same direction as the world does. It will be risky. It will require something of us. We think of Abraham. God calls him to sacrifice his son. Abraham can't explain this. Can't explain it to Sarah. He doesn't explain it to the servants. He never even explains it really to Isaac. He just says, God's going to provide. And they go up the mountain. God does provide. But he risks everything because God called him to go. Think of the man who finds a field and it looks pretty empty. He sells everything he has so he can buy the field because there's a great treasure inside of it. But can you imagine his family and his friends? What are you doing? Why are you selling all the things you've already got for some field that may not be worth anything to you? I think of Peter and John and Andrew and James. They're out fishing and they've got a business and a family business. And Jesus calls them, come follow me. And they drop their nets and they go because of who called them. There's many examples throughout the Bible of those who hear the call of God and respond, risking everything. They don't go because they know that there will be blessing afterward. They go because of who calls. We have to shift our thinking around faith, around God. He's not a means to increasing our share in the world, but rather he is the share that we want. If we seek a relationship with God because of an outside value that we're going to gain, then God becomes a tool for that value. We follow God because of who God is, because he has called us, and we hear his voice, and the sheep hear the master's voice and they know it, and so they respond. This is the type of relationship, this is the type of discipleship. So that night, after I visited with Chris Clements, my mind was kind of reeling, putting together the pieces of the idea of a God who shows up in time, in history, in relationship, as a minister, as a pastor, as a shepherd, and calls us out of the world to live lives that may risk everything. Not because we can get something better, but because we can come to be in relationship with the God who is. and the God who shows up. And as I was thinking about all of this and I was processing all of this, that same night I received a phone call. It was April 22nd. My little sister called and told me that my dad had taken his own life. So the next morning, I left the Lower Mainland and I drove to Calgary, where Kathleen and the girls were. They had taken a trip south to Arizona with her aunt. And I picked them up in Calgary, and then we drove home. And both of my sisters flew in to Edmonton. One of my sisters lives in Japan and one in Virginia, and so we're quite spread out. And so they flew in a couple days later, and they spent a week at my house. It's not the way I was planning to end a sabbatical, but we spent time together, the three of us, sharing stories, memories, and being in each other's company. This past month has been hard. May was supposed to be kind of a coming back with refreshed energy, and I think I've been given much grace and kindness from all of you, as May I have been struggling just to be here. Though this is the only place I wanted to be. So I say I'm struggling to be here, and yet I wanted to be here. There's nowhere else I wanted to go. This is my people. This is my family here. So you are my people. You are my family in many ways. This has been a difficult month. And I kept asking and thinking to myself, I've just learned that there's a God who shows up. I've spent this past 2 months hearing of a God who shows up, who steps into the now and the immediate to minister, to pastor, to care for his people. And that he speaks with a voice that his sheep can hear. And I thought, where's his voice and where's the God who shows up? Two Fridays ago, or 3, I guess, depends if you count this most recent Friday, a couple weeks back, I preached a message on youth night from the book of Revelation, chapter 5. It's my favorite chapter in the Bible. And what I love about that chapter is it puts Jesus in his rightful place as the conquering lion who conquered through his sacrificial death as the slain lamb. And all of the universe worships him in response to his worthiness, to his greatness. I love that chapter. And as I preached on that, and it just settled with me that God is on the throne. God is above all. God is in control. And I had placed him once again in that place of transcendence, where he rightly belongs. And then Sunday morning, 2 days after I preached that message on youth night, we sang a song in church, Holy Forever. And that's the one where it goes, and the angels cry, holy, and the people cry, holy. All creation cries, holy. That comes right out of Revelation 5, by the way. And I don't know what it was exactly about that song, but as we sang that song, I just about broke down right here where I always sit. But I held it together till the end of service, until everyone cleared out of the church. And I went to my office. I put the song on in my office, and I cried. I bawled, really, for an hour or so. I spent about an hour in my office that afternoon in prayer. I just called out to God. A lot of things happened there. I don't know how much of this I need to share, but a lot of things happened there for me. My dad and I have not had a good relationship for a long time, and there's a lot of resentment and anger, and I've had trouble having any compassion towards him. And that afternoon, while I cried, that broke. And I prayed to God, God, just be gentle with my dad. That night, I had already, shoot, thought I could do this without getting too emotional. That night, I was having another sleepless night, as I'd been having for several weeks. And the weather was kind of stormy and miserable, just like my mind and my emotions and my soul. It's all kind of stormy, despite having that time of prayer that afternoon. And then came into my mind a memory, maybe a voice. There's a memory from something I learned in Freedom Session about if someone has passed away that you have unresolved stuff with, you can write them a letter. And they can never read it, but you can write it. It can help you with the healing process. So it was 2 a.m, and I pulled out my laptop and started writing. And then I fell asleep around 4 a.m. When I woke up, on my laptop was the letter I'd written. It was completed. And so I read it again. And as I read, I prayed and I carefully considered whether the words of the letter were true. Had I truly forgiven him? Did I truly love my dad? Will I truly miss my dad? And I think I honestly can say yes. And as I prayed and read these things, it felt like beside me was an old friend with his hand on my shoulder. And I knew my God was with me, ministering to my heart in that time. I talked this all through with someone the other day and I didn't cry like this. So I was pretty sure I could handle it this morning. Anyways. I know, it's okay. Okay. In one of those books that I'd listened to on my long drive, the author talked about where transformation comes from. How are we transformed as people? How are we grown and shaped? I actually have tissues here, thanks. It's just a matter of using them. What shapes us and what grows us? In this book, the author, same author as the other books, suggested that some people seek to be transformed by performing heroic actions, by doing great things and seeing themselves as heroes. Others do it through self-improvement. But there's a third group of people who see transformation as something that comes from beyond themselves. In the book, he calls them beyonders. Those who see transformation as that which comes from beyond. And in the moment, in that day, as I prayed and read, I felt a closeness with the one who is beyond me. He is a comforter and a friend. And it was like a cloud lifted. And since that day, I've felt solid again. Maybe a good word for it. I'm sure it's not over. I've been told this kind of grief is complicated and lasts a long time. And will come and go and show up while you're preaching a sermon. But for several weeks, I felt like I was under a dark cloud. And from that day forward, I didn't. I felt like it's been bright again. I've been able to move again. And I've been able to find the joy in the youth ministry that I love so much again. A lot has happened over the past 3 months. The sabbatical was an excellent and wonderful experience and journey. It didn't end the way I'd hoped it would, but it did. And even there, though, the theme continued. God showed up. God shows up. Not just as some powerful deity, fire and cloud or lightning, but he shows up as a minister, as a pastor, as a shepherd who calls to his people. He calls to us to walk out of this world, and that might have great risk, that we might respond to the Father's voice. So my prayer for us all is that we would learn to hear that voice and to connect with the God who shows up. Let me pray for you. I'd invite you as well to stay for small groups after the service. Let me pray for you guys. Lord God, we thank you that you are a God who shows up, that you love and care and minister to your people. Lord, I thank you for this church and this congregation, for their great love for one another, for their great love for you, for the great love they've shown to me and my family. Lord, I pray that you would just continue to work here in these people's hearts, that you would call and they would hear your voice. And Lord, give us the strength and the courage to obey and to respond.